Genevieve Lloyd from University of New South Wales. The talk is about Voltaire in response to Leibniz, hope or illusion. We have until 16:45.
Well, it's commonly accepted, almost a truth universally acknowledged, as Jane Austen might say, that the views spouted by Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide do not amount to a fair rendering of Leibniz's doctrine that this is the best of all possible worlds. Friedrich Beiser, for example, in his book Diotimous Children, describes Candide as a vicious parody. I want to argue that when we see Candide in the context of other pieces by Voltaire, we get a rather different picture of the upshot, though not the intent, of his responses to Leibniz. In particular, I want to suggest that if we shift our attention away from Leibniz's principle of the best to his principle of sufficient reason, we can see, in fact, some clear affinities between the two thinkers. Notwithstanding Voltaire's sarcasm at the expense of Leibniz, there is a positive legacy from the Theodicy which runs, strange though it may initially seem, through Voltaire. But first, a few observations on Leibniz and Pangloss. In the preface to the Theodicy, Leibniz talks of a labyrinth concerning the great question of the free and the necessary in the origin and production of evil. A labyrinth which perplexes almost all the human race. Central to that perplexity for Leibniz is the idea of fate, which he thinks comes in three varieties. His preferred form is what he presents as a Christian version, a fate which reconciles rather than dispirits. He articulates it through contrasts with two other forms. On the one hand, there's what he calls fatum Mahometanum, or as he goes on to call it, fate after the Turkish fashion. The sense of fate thus understood introduces an inertia which rests, he says, on a sophism which the ancients called the lazy reason, an acquiescence in what must happen regardless of what efforts we might make. On the other hand, there's fatum Stoicum, the fate of the Stoics. This sense of fate, Leibniz acknowledges, was not just a bleak endurance. It brought some tranquility through the acceptance of necessity. Yet, in fact, it imparts only a forced patience, he thinks, rather than true contentment. Returning later in the Theodicy to the contrasts between the different kinds of fate, Leibniz says that the lazy reason of Mahometan fate overthrows foresight and good counsel in its assertion of a preposterous and unendurable fatality. As for the Stoics, he comments that they were foolish to think that somehow things can become pleasing just because they are necessary. What is more, something that is evil for me will not, as the Stoics seem to suggest, cease to be so, he says, just because it is for my master's good, unless this good somehow reflects back to me. In contrast, for those who have a sense of Christian fate, quoting now from Leibniz, it is no small thing to be content with God and with the universe, not to fear what destiny has in store for us, not to complain of what befalls us. Acquaintance with true principles gives us this advantage, quite other than the Stoics and Epicureans derived from their philosophy. There is as much difference between true morality and theirs as there is between joy and patience. For their tranquility was founded only on necessity, while ours must rest upon the perfections and beauty of things, upon our own happiness. At the core of this preferred fate for Leibniz is a sense of the fitness of things, a pervasive sense of things being as they are because that is the best possible arrangement, the best even thinkable as able to exist. It's that sense of fitness which is supposed to make it reconciling rather than dispiriting. It provides a path for turning the acceptance of necessity into something joyful, a transformation which, according to Leibniz, was lacking in the Stoic version of fate. So the three fates are supposed to involve different affective responses to necessity. In contrast to inertia and forced patience, Leibniz's preferred sense of fate is supposed to be a loving response to what has been freely chosen by a God who knows what is best, a God who chooses in accordance with the principle of the best. The God of the Theodicy, intent on providing for our true happiness, does not choose evil, but he does, in his infinite wisdom, permit it. He incorporates into the world he chooses to create not only what human beings will freely do, but also the operations of his healing grace in response to evil done. Thus, he says, if the smallest evil that comes to pass in the world were missing in it, it would no longer be this world, which with nothing omitted and all allowance made, was found the best by the Creator who chose to make it. What Leibniz offers in all this is a powerful synthesis of Christian doctrine with ancient philosophy, of divine free will with what he sees as positive in ancient fate. And at the heart of it all is his idea of perfection. And the role of that idea of perfection is central also to Voltaire's resistance to Leibniz. Despite its detailed argumentation, a tone of pious trust in the perfection of God and his works runs through the Theodicy. Intellectually ingenious though the synthesis often is, its persuasiveness can seem often to rest on emotional resonances, including aesthetic responses to that idea of perfection. Optimism can sometimes seem just as much a precondition for being convinced by Leibniz's reasoning as it is a rational consequence of it. Those overtones of pious trust are picked up, though doubtless exaggerated, in some of the gushing flows of mindless verbiage that Voltaire puts into the mouth of Pangloss. I have proved, says Leibniz, the real Leibniz, that God cannot fail to produce the best, and from that assumption it follows that all the evils we experience could not have been reasonably excluded from the universe since they are there. There is, of course, no indication in Candide of the wealth of argumentation that lies behind that concluding, since they are there. But the confident tone does lend itself to a satirical rendering. Given that things are the way they are, it must be the case that all is for the best. So in Pangloss's glib version, we have, all is for the best, for if there's a volcano at Lisbon, it couldn't be anywhere else. For it's impossible for things not to be where they are, for all is well. There are, of course, many points in Voltaire's relentless ridicule of Pangloss, where the subtleties of Leibniz's version of Theodicy are ignored. It is Pangloss, not Leibniz, who claims that everything is for the best, not just for the whole, but for each individual part. For Leibniz, the best possible world is the best overall, not the best for any one individual thing. What is more, Pangloss claims to know that there is an explanation to be offered for why each individual thing or event is as it is, of how it fits into the best of all possible worlds. His purported explanations are, of course, idiotic. But Leibniz, unlike Pangloss, makes no such claim in the first place. Indeed, Leibniz suggests that it is a futile exercise to persist in seeking an explanation for the existence of evil by asking exactly how each occurrence is connected to the general good. Responding to Bayle's scepticism about how we could possibly know that, Leibniz says that he has no intention of giving a complete explanation of how evil is connected with the best possible scheme for the whole. It is, he says, sufficient for me to point out that there is nothing to prevent the connection of a certain individual evil with what is best on the whole. Still, not everything about Pangloss can be so readily dismissed. For there is more going on in Candide than the content of Pangloss's arguments for the actual world being the best possible. What is more important to Voltaire is what is unfitting in Pangloss's way of responding to human misery. What is at issue here becomes clearer if we let Pangloss be for the moment and look instead at Voltaire's poem on the Lisbon Earthquake, which was a more immediate expression of his frustration with the metaphysical optimists. Like many of his contemporaries, Voltaire was quick to put his own moral construction on the event of November the 1st, 1755. On November the 24th, he wrote in a letter to the banker Tronchin, "What a wretched gamble is the game of human life. That ought to teach men not to persecute each other, for while a few holy scoundrels burn a few fanatics, the earth swallows up one and all." The poem was conceived quickly and completed before the end of November. But Voltaire had given much prior thought to the problem of evil, and his hostility to what he thought of as metaphysical optimism was already well developed long before the earthquake. Voltaire would have been familiar with the content of the Theodicy, though it is unlikely that he read it much before 1764, the year his philosophical dictionary was published, with its entry on All is Well. In 1733, Pope had published his Essay on Man, in which he affirmed that whatever is right, that inspiring or infuriating summation of the wise mind's attitude towards catastrophe. All nature is but art unknown to thee, all chance direction which thou canst not see, all discord harmony not understood, all partial evil universal good. And spite of pride, in erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right. Voltaire admired the Essay on Man, despite having reservations about its theme of optimism, or at any rate about the way that theme had been taken up by French followers of Pope. There are other versions also of the best possible worlds doctrine, Bolingbroke and Shaftesbury among them. What annoyed Voltaire about all of them was the putative solace their authors presumed to bring to human misery. There were three interconnected themes at play in his repudiation of that solace. First, the human-centred construction it puts on ancient ideas of the interconnection of all things. Second, the presumptuous attitude he thought it expressed towards human capacity for knowledge. And third, the most surprising thing perhaps, its destructive implications for the possibility of hope. It's that theme of the conditions for hope that is most significant for understanding Voltaire's general resistance to metaphysical optimism. Theodore Besterman reports that Voltaire wrote in the margin of his copy of the Essay on Man, at the point where Pope exhorts his readers to hope, "What can I hope when all is right?" It's a neat point and one that underlies Voltaire's later critique of Leibnizian optimism in Candide. As Voltaire sees it, rather than being a source of optimism, the doctrine that this is the best of all possible worlds actually undermines the very possibility of hope. He goes further in a letter of February 1756, where he says that philosophical optimism is really a cruel philosophy under a consoling name. And he goes yet further in a remark in his entry on All is Good in the Philosophical Dictionary. There he observes that metaphysical optimism is actually a source of despair. So far from the notion of the best of possible worlds being consoling, he says, it drives to despair the philosophers who embrace it. Well, Voltaire, in all that, does not want to resist the old idea, embraced especially by the Stoics, of humanity as a tiny part of a vast whole. He appeals to it himself throughout his works. But as we'll see, he gives it a rather different twist, oriented towards ideals of tolerance rather than to optimism. What he resists is the folly, the vain wisdom, as he puts it, of offering that old idea of an eternal chain of events as a solace to present misery. Using the idea in that way, he thinks, involves a presumptuous attitude to human knowledge. The presumption that, as he puts it in the Lisbon poem, thinking atoms can know the chain of which they are part. Criticism of the presumed knowledge of the thinking atoms is more appropriately addressed to Pangloss than to the real Leibniz. But there is a broader issue which is closer to the heart of Leibniz's rationalism: Voltaire's resistance to all-encompassing philosophical systems. Running through the Lisbon poem is Voltaire's admiration for the scepticism of the great and wise, as he calls him, Pierre Bayle, whom he sees as having not only overthrown all systems, but as having then gone on to question his own beliefs. As Besterman sums it up, Voltaire's highest praise of Bayle was that he was wise enough to have no system. Leibniz, of course, could be taken as epitomising the rationalist's desire for all-encompassing system. And although he thinks it is folly to suppose that we can know in any detail how a particular event relates to the goodness of the harmonious whole, he does nonetheless appeal to the idea of that interconnected whole as a source of solace. And Voltaire objects to that generality, as well as to the presumption of more specific knowledge about just how it all fits, which he attributes to Pangloss in Candide. For Voltaire, the idea of the good of the whole in no way compensates for the misery of the suffering part. Nor can the future good of others be thought of as a solace for our own present misery. As he says in the poem, there is no comfort in being told that a general bliss will emerge from our individual woes, that others will rebuild Lisbon and prosper from that enterprise, or presumably that philosophers might come here a few centuries hence to discuss the problem of evil as a result. He distinguishes between talking of the best of all possible worlds as expressing a future and as a judgment of how things really are in the present. One day all will be good, that is our hope. All is good today, that is the illusion. The idea of the best of all possible worlds can take the form either of hope directed to the future or of illusion about the present. Voltaire, it seems, wants to reject the illusion but to retain the hope. But what is the content of this hope that Voltaire endorses in the Lisbon poem? Interpretation can divide here along the fault lines of the vexed question of Voltaire's attitude to religion. In a long note to the poem, he says that its author believes nothing but the hope of our existence being continued in a future state can console us under our present misfortunes. And there's a suggestion in the poem itself that the present is indeed sad if thinking beings are doomed to extinction. Yet there is ambiguity, I think, in Voltaire's hope for the future. He writes in many voices on religion. In the larger context of his writings, it's difficult to sustain a religiously orthodox reading of the content of his hope that one day all will be good. To my ear, it strikes a similar note to that other often discussed ambiguity, in Candide's final resolve that what matters is that we must cultivate our garden. Opinion can differ on whether that resolve is an expression of a desire to withdraw from society to eat pistachios, or of an act of determination to engage in social reform. It does, however, seem clear that Voltaire is there evoking hope in an earthly future garden rather than in a paradisial afterlife. And I think he strikes a similar note of earthly hope in the Lisbon poem. It is not the hope of bliss in an afterlife that he finds sustaining. It is the hope that things might be made better by human effort in this life. What Voltaire presents as the Leibnizian idea of present perfection is counterbalanced by later Enlightenment ideas of perfectibility. Voltaire's version of earthly hope takes its content from his outraged rejection of all is well as an appropriate response to present suffering. However, I want also to argue that Voltaire's idea of perfectibility does nonetheless have some affinities and continuities with the content of the real Leibniz's version of the idea of perfection. Counterintuitive though it may seem, it may be precisely in rejecting the optimist's all is well that Voltaire comes closest to the real Leibniz. To bring out the continuities here, I want now to focus on the sense of fitness, which Leibniz supposed distinguished his version of the acceptance of necessity from both inertia and forced patience. For there are reverberations of it, I think, in Voltaire's sense of the grotesqueness of offering all is good today as a response to human misery. For Voltaire, that is an affront to the sense of fitness. This is in some ways an aesthetic matter, but it is also a moral one. It is not just a matter of decorum or etiquette. It's an issue of appropriateness in affective response. There is a depth of the sense of fitness here, which I want to suggest brings Voltaire into a common space with Leibniz. For there is an affective, aesthetic dimension also to Leibniz's own principle of sufficient reason, but more of that a little bit later. Voltaire, of course, willfully exaggerates the grotesqueness of Pangloss's insensitive responses to human suffering. But as he sees it, there's a similar lack of fitness, in a more refined form, at the core of Leibniz's template for responding to the catastrophes that afflict human beings. What is basically wrong, Voltaire thinks, is the attempt to shift focus away from the awful immediacy of the here and now to a more general apprehension of the beautiful interconnected whole of which it is supposedly a part. In response, Voltaire demands a shift in the other direction, away from the abstraction of the optimist's harmonious whole to the immediacy of present suffering. For Leibniz, the real Leibniz, the shift of perspective to the whole is not meant to involve any denial of the immediate reality. Nor does he say anything to suggest that it would be appropriate to thrust, as Voltaire has Pangloss do, the beautiful abstraction at those actually suffering the concrete calamity in the here and now. However, Voltaire's point is not just that sensitivity or propriety demands restraining that urge to offer the idea of the harmonious whole as comfort. He resists the content of the thought, not just the timing and circumstance of its expression. He sees that shift of perspective itself as grotesque. This alleged grotesqueness has many layers, and I want now to look at it a bit more closely. On the one hand, there's the suggestion of the aridity of metaphysical abstractions in general. Pangloss is the archetype of the metaphysician who spouts what Voltaire, elsewhere in his philosophical dictionary, calls quiddities, pointless, trivial distinctions. Again, Voltaire's admiration for Bayle's rejection of systems is in the background there. And it is perhaps ironic here that Leibniz himself seems to have intended the Theodicy as a popular work accessible to the general reading public, rather than aimed at metaphysicians, though he can hardly have intended it as the playful exercise of which one of his critics sarcastically accused him. Maria Rosa Antognazza, in her biography of Leibniz, quotes an exchange he had with a Lutheran theologian who had suggested that since Leibniz's alleged refutation of Bayle's scepticism seemed in fact to support that scepticism, the work must have been meant as a playful joke, a jeu d'esprit. Turning the sarcasm back on his critic, Leibniz facetiously replied, "You have hit the nail on the head, and I am amazed there has been no one hitherto who has sensed that this is my game, for it is not for philosophers always to take things seriously." Well, as a jeu d'esprit, clearly the Theodicy cannot compete with Candide. But there is in any case a deeper level to Voltaire's resistance to Leibnizian abstractions in relation to the problem of evil. Voltaire's critique, I think, is in some ways similar to Johnson's famous repudiation of Berkeley's idealism by saying, "Thus I refute him while kicking a stone." In something of that spirit, Voltaire had written several years before the earthquake, challenging a critic on the theme of optimism. "Just show me why so many men slit each other's throats in the best of all possible worlds, and I shall be greatly obliged to you." In response to a metaphysical abstraction, Voltaire offers a confrontation with the horrible reality. Philosophically, of course, Leibniz so far need not be bothered by this manoeuvre any more than Berkeley should have been bothered by Johnson's. Leibniz never suggested that the reality of human suffering was illusory, or that its reality could be reduced to painless, abstract thought. Yet there is something that comes out of that comparison with Johnson and Berkeley. For Voltaire to offer as comfort the reflection that a catastrophic event has its place in the interconnected whole is to exercise an inappropriate form of detachment. It is to turn away from the challenges of a painful reality which demands spontaneous thought, to retreat to a level of trite, tired abstraction. In terms of the Berkeley comparison, we might see it as like trying to comfort someone who has stubbed a toe on a stone by observing that both toe and stone ultimately exist only as ideas. In the Lisbon poem, Voltaire predicts that the chilling, undaunted courage and stoical tranquillity of the detached spectators will give way if they themselves cease to be mere observers. But when, like us, fate's rigours you have felt become humane, like us, you'll learn to melt. Voltaire's optimists regard the laments of their suffering brethren as an expression of human pride, as an inadequacy which can be rectified by philosophical reflection. From their perspective, those who complain at fate are in the grip of a distorted expectation of what is due to them in their supposedly privileged position in the natural world. In reply, the voice of the poet insists that those who groan are not proud. The poem turns the allegation of pride back on the optimists. Pride, for Voltaire, here resides in the assumption that the thinking atoms can find meaning in the place supposedly allotted to the suffering of others in the harmonious whole. But let's now look more closely at how Leibniz himself saw that shift of perception from the part to the consideration of the whole. Analogies with distance do recur throughout the Theodicy, and it's the idea of withdrawing to the supposed solace of a more distant point of vision from which one is able to see the whole that Voltaire finds offensive. However, in an earlier piece written in 1702, Leibniz offers a rather different content for this idea of standing back, drawn from an analogy with motion and with human action rather than vision. He was replying to Bayle's rejection in his dictionary entry on Rorarius of the very idea of a rational theodicy. The reason for permitting evil, Leibniz says there, rests in the eternal possibilities, in accordance with which the kind of universe that allows evil and has admitted it to actual existence is found to be more perfect considering the whole than all other possible kinds. And he goes on, it is a matter of taking a step back, so to speak, in order to leap forward better. The metaphor of standing back is there nuanced towards active response, towards leaping, rather than to passive perceiving. There are other letters and fragments, quoted in Angugnaz's biography, which suggest that Leibniz reworked that metaphor of the leap over a period of time. He used it primarily in relation to God's creative activity, but also sometimes in relation to the created world itself and to human understanding of that world. The metaphor is used in a fragment from around 1701, in which Leibniz discusses the idea of progress and spirals of time. And thus it would be agreeable, he says, that the same human being should be brought back, not simply by returning to Earth, but as if through a spiral or winding way, thence progressing to something greater. That is, to go back, to leap better forward, as at a ditch. And later in that same source, our happiness will never consist and should not consist in complete satisfaction, where there is nothing else to desire, which would render our mind stupid, but in a perpetual progress to new pleasures and new perfections. We had a bit of discussion about this in the last paper. The core idea there is that God's creative act involves something akin to standing back in response to the apprehension of imperfection in order to leap forward with the production of greater perfection than would have been present without that initial flaw. There's a dynamism in this version of the metaphor which contrasts with the passivity of the more visual versions of standing back. Antognazar sums up the upshot of these fragments by saying, in Leibniz's view, even the supreme happiness of the beatific vision consisted not in a static permanence in a final state, but in an unending progress towards the best. In one of the last fragments, written in 1715, not long before his death, he writes to Sophie, "It is not consonant with the divine harmony to fiddle away on the same string forever. And one should believe instead that due to natural reasons of congruence, things are bound to progress for the better, whether gradually or sometimes even by leaps and bounds. Although at times things do seem to change for the worse, this should be regarded as similar to the way in which we sometimes retrace our footsteps in order to leap forward with greater vigour." Well, I have been indulging there in a play with metaphors, but I don't think it's too far-fetched to see that way of thinking of standing back reflected in the model of detachment which Leibniz, the real Leibniz, brings to the philosopher's contemplation of human wretchedness. In response to the perception of imperfection, there is a mental leap forward. The perceiver apprehends a possibility of greater perfection, a perfectibility inherent in the perception of imperfection. It is a dynamic form of detachment which contrasts with the passivity of the inadequate affective responses to fate as necessity, which he described in the preface to the Theodicy. It is primarily God's activity that is invoked in those fragments in the metaphor of the leap, but it passes readily, I think, into a model for human response to the perception of imperfection, and I think it's one that Leibniz would accept. Focusing on this repudiation of the stupor of complete satisfaction brings Leibniz closer to Voltaire. Voltaire's own response to avoidable human suffering is one of outrage, directed not at natural disasters as such, but at the human inadequacies and irrationalities that they make visible. His effective response is more akin to Swift's lacerating indignation at human folly than to the exultation implicit in Pope's "whatever is right." Leibniz's talk of standing back to better leap forward involves a different kind of detachment from Pope's "whatever is right." It brings him closer, I think, to Voltaire's future-directed hope. All this suggests that Leibniz's version of all is good may be less static, less acquiescent, less imbued with fate than might at first appear. In this version, we can imagine the human mind saying as it stands back, things can be made better for the future, or even just, this should not be, rather than, it's fine now, if only we can see it all clearly. I'm now going to try to bring Leibniz and Voltaire even closer by focusing on some of the more clearly affective or aesthetic aspects of the Theodicy itself. And I'll be drawing here on Frederick Byes's account of those aspects of the Theodicy in his book Diotima's Children. Beiser presents Leibniz as a progenitor, more precisely as a grandfather, of a doctrine of aesthetic rationalism centred on the idea of perfection, which reached its most explicit expression in the works of later German philosophers. Beiser identifies this idea of perfection as a matter of unity in variety, an idea, of course, which has Leibnizian overtones. Leibniz's God, as he resonates in Beiser's aesthetic rationalism, is primarily a solver of intellectual challenges in bringing about diversity without falling into contradiction. This God is a solver of intellectual problems in the most elegant way, rather than a benign provider for human needs. The idea of perfection, thus construed as imbued with beauty, reaches back, and fecundity, reaches back through Leibniz to Platonic thought, hence the title of Beiser's book, Diotimus' Children. Beauty confirms the existence of perfection in the universe. So when Leibniz declared this to be the best of all possible worlds, says Beiser, he might also have added that it is the most beautiful. Perfection is truth, the reality of a thing. It is also goodness, because goodness consists in self-realization, actualizing the nature or essence of the thing in harmony with other things. And it is beauty, because beauty is harmony and the pleasure we take in contemplating it. That's what Beiser presents as a classic unity there between those three concepts: truth, goodness and beauty united in the idea of perfection. It's possible to disagree with Beiser about just how central the concern with beauty is to Leibniz's Theodicy. But his account of the interconnections of truth and beauty in the Leibnizian idea of perfection, and of the interconnections between that idea of perfection and the principle of sufficient reason, does illuminate, I think, some of those passages in the Theodicy where Leibniz uses illustrations drawn from art and performance. His comparison of evil with the shadows in a beautiful picture fits a visual model, but there are other examples which resonate with a more dynamic content for the understanding of perfection and imperfection, the frisson of fear that makes us enjoy dramatic representations of tragedy, the heart-stopping spectacle of tightrope walkers almost, but not quite, falling. Beiser's stress on the aesthetic aspects of Leibniz's idea of perfection allows us to see that the recognition of imperfection is associated with a recognition of alternative possibilities, of ways the world might have been. Engaging with the near misses allows us to see the contingency and the richness of what is actual. It's no accident that the perception of beauty is often accompanied by the poignancy of fragility. We come to see the actual in the light of the possible, and space then opens for the idea of perfection to morph into the idea of perfectibility. And it's here that we can see the beginnings of a rapprochement between Leibniz and Voltaire. If the task of formulating the point were given to Pangloss, he might say that a world in which tragedy can occur is also a world rich in possibilities. But we can make the point in terms more apt to Leibniz's own formulation of ideas of perfection and sufficient reason. To see things through the idea of perfection is to see possibilities for things to have been less good than they are, and to recognise imperfection is to see possibilities for things to be better. In terms of the metaphor of leaping, for every imperfect reality, there is the possibility of a stepping back to better realise a transition to something better. We can think of that either in relation to God's creation or in relation to human contemplation of it. The existence of imperfection in the world can then be seen as an impetus to bringing about greater perfection. I'm not suggesting that this notion of a world improved through human action is what Leibniz had in mind. My point here is just that there are conceptual transitions that can be traced that can take us from Leibniz's idea of perfection to Voltaire's impatience with whatever is right. In making those moves, I've drawn on Beizer's account of the interconnections between Leibniz's idea of perfection and his principle of sufficient reason. But the crucial point is recognised by other commentators on the Theodicy. Leibnizian perfection involves a reconciliation of possibilities, and actuality involves the exclusion of those possibles that cannot be reconciled into a coherent whole. As Stephen Nadler puts it in his book The Best of All Possible Worlds, for Leibniz, perfection involves a conjunction of the maximal simplicity of laws and a maximal quantity and richness of effects, the superior laws being more fecund. In this context, talk of the fecundity of Leibniz's idea of perfection captures also, I think, what I have described as his seeing the actual in the light of unrealised, excluded possibilities. That theme of the reconciliation and exclusion of possibles in the actual runs through Leibniz's metaphysics. It echoes Spinoza's reflections in discussing the infinite on how all determination involves negation, an observation which caught Hegel's attention in his discussion of Spinoza in his lectures on the history of philosophy. Everything actual excludes something. Leibniz, of course, challenged Spinoza's version of the doctrine of a necessarily interconnected totality by insisting on the freedom of divine purpose, expressed in terms of sufficient reason for things being as they are. But they both saw the interconnections of the actual, the necessary, and the possible. We might add on Leibniz's behalf that for every imperfect reality, there is the possibility of God's metaphorically standing back to better realise a leap to something better. And on Voltaire's behalf, that for every exposed injustice perpetrated by flawed human rationality, there is the possibility of things being improved. By the time the Philosophical Dictionary was published in 1764, Voltaire was more inclined to target Leibniz directly. His entry on All is Good strikes an acerbic note. There was a fine row in the schools, he says, and even among people who think, when Leibniz, paraphrasing Plato, built his edifice on the best of all possible worlds and imagined that all was for the best. Leibniz, he says, did mankind the service of explaining that we ought to be entirely satisfied and that God could do no more for us, that he had necessarily chosen among all the possibilities what was undeniably the best one. The sarcasm is directed just as much at the Genesis story of the origins of evil as it is at Leibniz's assurance that all is well. And the biblical story and the doctrine of the best of all possible worlds are woven together in Voltaire's comments. What, to be chased from a place of delights where we would have lived forever if an apple had not been eaten? What, to undergo every illness, feel every sorrow, die in pain, and for refreshment be burned in the eternity of centuries? Is this really the best lot that was available? Leibniz realised that these questions were unanswerable, so he wrote thick books in which he did not agree with himself. Voltaire is now more explicit and harsher on what he sees as the arrogance of the metaphysician's claims to know the truth of things. His own answer to the question of the origin of evil is, don't ask. Knowing becomes for Voltaire a work that is forever in progress, and not knowing, rather than something to be ashamed of, becomes something to celebrate. He goes on in the entry on the limits of the human mind to praise, I do not know, as a response to abstruse questions. And he mocks the conceited upstarts who think that they can buy the right to judge and to condemn what they do not understand. Whereas Montaigne's motto was, what do I know, he observes. Theirs is, what do I not know? In the Lisbon poem, Voltaire had angrily rejected the suggestion that it was pride, the conviction of humanity's special place in the whole, that stood in the way of acceptance. In the Philosophical Dictionary, he turns the charge of pride more strongly back on the metaphysicians, the system builders. With their arrogant claims to know, they nurture intolerance and cruelty. The point is most starkly presented in the dictionary entry on torture. It includes a sardonic account of the case of the Chevalier de la Barre, who was executed after horrific torture for supposedly mocking a religious procession. Voltaire expresses his outrage in passages of scathing irony about the etymological connections between torture and knowledge. Playing on the derivations which construe torture in terms of the putting of the question, he comments that this strange way of questioning was not invented by the merely curious. His brief account of that Labar case is cleverly constructed so as to juxtapose the triviality of the alleged offences with positive connotations of intellectual curiosity carried by talk of putting the question. Quoting, "When the Chevalier de Labar, grandson of a lieutenant general, a very intelligent and promising young man, but with all the thoughtlessness of wild youth, was convicted of singing impious songs and even of passing a procession of Capuchins without taking his hat off, the judges of Abbeville, people comparable to Roman senators, ordered not only that his tongue be torn out, his hand cut off, and his body burned on a slow fire, but they also put him to the torture to discover exactly how many songs he had sung and how many processions he had watched with his hat on." Voltaire's association of torture there with the need to know is deliberately disproportionate. Putting the question here takes on grotesque associations with an obsessive concern with knowing trivia. The uselessness of the knowledge is juxtaposed with the savagery of the process of obtaining it. All this allows Voltaire to present the practice of torture in his own times as a gross abuse of power. Woe to a nation which, long civilised, is still led by atrocious ancient practices. Defective attitudes to knowing, in particular obsessive concern with trivial details, the kind he associates with the metaphysicians, removed from apparent concern with human well-being, are here presented as inextricably enmeshed with abuse of power. In other writings, Voltaire connected lack of doubt, even more explicitly with self-centred intolerance. In the famous prayer, if that's what it is, which concludes his treatise on tolerance, published in 1766, he returns to that old theme of the tininess of humanity, feeble creatures lost in the immensity of space. Voltaire's so-called prayer expresses neither obeisance before a transcendent God, nor self-congratulation on a supposed special status for humanity in his creation. It is not so much an honouring of a preconceived deity as an alternative vision of humanity's relations with the universe as a whole. Rather than conjuring up a conventional God with whom human beings are supposed to have a special relationship, the prayer resonates with the tones of ancient Stoic awe and wonder at the cosmos of which humanity is but a tiny, insignificant part. To be aware of the interconnection of all things is also to be aware of how small our own part in the whole is, and hence of how little consequence our differences in human customs, beliefs, or religious practices. The prayer ends sardonically, "Grant that those who light candles in the full light of day to worship thee should look with kindness upon those others who are content with the light of thy sun." That passage from the end of the treatise on tolerance is of a piece with other writings on tolerance, which Voltaire wrote at about the same time as the Philosophical Dictionary. Outrage at unjust treatment emanating from zealous religious belief with the conviction that one knows had swayed, he thought, and that religious fervour combining with the illusion of knowing had swayed the administration of justice. In those pieces, his anger is directed against the presumption implicit in the exalted status which fervent religious believers, he thought, so readily give to human presence in the world, at the exaggeration of human importance which often accompanies the claim to know the truth. For Voltaire, it is lack of doubt, not the humane melting under the impact of catastrophe, which he defends in the Lisbon poem, which is the true face of pride. Perversely as he sees it, the zealot's exaggeration of human significance is often combined with apparent indifference to human suffering. The connections between tolerance and the celebration of doubt, bringing us to conclusion now, are particularly strong in Voltaire's later work, The Ignorant Philosopher. It's a collection of fragments in varying genres, much of it oriented to an ideal of acknowledged and accepted not knowing. He's not interested in cataloguing what is or is not known. His emphasis is not on the achieved goal of knowledge. It's rather on capturing the movement of thought involved in the search for truth, on the activity of inquiry rather than the stasis of belief. In a letter of 1776, he talks of his intention, not carried out, to include a frontispiece in the published version of The Ignorant Philosopher. He says, "The thing is to represent 3 blind men who grope after a fleeing donkey. This is the symbol of all philosophers who run after the truth. I consider myself one of the blindest. I always run after my donkey. So it is my portrait for which I am asking you." It may not be a very edifying image of the philosopher's search for knowledge. Yet despite Voltaire's disdain for Leibnizian metaphysics, the content of that image resonates, I think, with some of Leibniz's imagery of the restlessness of reason. I want to suggest in conclusion that despite Voltaire's ridicule of him, we can see the spirit of Leibniz in Voltaire's indignation at what he sees as the failures of reason in his own times. There was in that indignation a deep sense of thwarted expectations of rationality and of the terrible consequences of those failures of reason. People seem to believe, he says in a letter of 1769, that our century is merely ridiculous. In fact, it is horrible. He was outraged by what he saw as irrational cruelties perpetrated on the basis of supposedly knowing the truth. He was outraged too, in that context, by what he saw as the pointless quiddities that occupied the metaphysicians in his own dark times. But we misread him if we see him only as the ridiculer of Panglossian metaphysics. He has his own sense of fitness, steeped in respect for reason. His outrage is directed at how human beings behave on their tiny molehill in the vast whole, at the abuse of power which comes with the cry, "What do I not know?" The sarcasm, the savage humour are directed against injustices perpetrated in the name of knowing, on the assumption of having already reached the truth. Voltaire saw Leibniz as one of those metaphysicians who think they know. But we can now see Leibniz through Voltaire. That yields a richer legacy of the Theodicy than we might otherwise have had. A legacy, perhaps, which can stand back in order to leap forward.
Brandon.
I'll start to follow rolling. So I guess I'm confused a little bit with the argument in that you said Voltaire wrote in the margins of Pope's Essay to Man, what can I hope for if all is right? And you said that for Voltaire then, philosophical optimism led to despair. But then Voltaire, left to his own devices, looked at history, looked at his fellow human beings, and despaired at their activities. So the idea that it leads to despair, that can't be an argument per se against it.
No, it wasn't.
He despaired as well about mankind.
No, it wasn't. Thanks. I wasn't arguing that Voltaire himself, was an optimist, or that but Voltaire's pessimism, if we can, I'm not sure that the optimism-pessimism dichotomy actually captures what we need here. He had a bleak view of his times, but the difference between that and why he accepted his own bleakness was that I don't think he was particularly troubled by whether one was personally an optimist or a pessimist. What angered him was the way the metaphysical optimists, as he called them, and that in itself may have been a false kind of generalisation, too big a pool that he was putting a lot of very different thinkers in, that they drew their optimism from a metaphysical construction of how the world was. And what's more, that they used that to try to persuade other people to share an optimistic view. So I think that leaves quite untouched the issue of how bad Voltaire expected things could get, or whether he was. I mean, I've read some discussions of Voltaire. It's true, best of himself. I think that treat the whole issue of Voltaire's attitude to optimism as if it's something which reflected his own intellect, his own emotional state at the time. So at different periods of his life, he passed from optimism to pessimism, and then somehow that they try to read back into that something about his arguments with the people he's attacking. I don't think the personal bleakness issue is. I think that's quite separable from the more philosophical points. Now, Voltaire is no philosopher, really. I mean, he's not engaging with the philosophical depths of Leibniz. But he is making a point about philosophy, about the upshot of philosophy. And I think that's left intact.
Okay. Andrew.
Thanks. Actually, about the same little aphorism in the margin. What can I hope when all is right? I guess I'm also curious. Suppose hope is something like a belief that something is possible combined with a desire for it, but doesn't involve certainty about what it is. It seems as though the epistemological opacity is still in place, even if you're an optimist, to hope all sorts of things. I mean, you don't have to go quietist or fatalist. You could say, I hope about the details that, things will get better in such and such a way. I hope I'll be part of it. I hope that we don't all just sit back and let things happen, but try to become part of ongoing perfectibility. So that seems consistent with the picture that God's doing this thing, putting together all these different kinds of goods in the best possible way. And there's enough epistemic sort of opacity there for us to have all kinds of hopes and social engagements.
Yes, again, I want to respond to that by making a distinction between optimism at the personal level, emotion. I mean, and of course, a philosophical pessimist doesn't have to be a bleak personality, and vice versa. The metaphysical optimist could be very good people. When it comes down, of course, it's how do we know what exactly Voltaire had in mind when he wrote that? I take it as an expression of anger against the metaphysical construction of the world as not as being all right as it is. That's his point. If everything really is all right as it is, and again, this may well be an unfair way of taking Pope, and yet it might well have been a fair way of taking some of the way that Pope was taken up in France. It is a remark, I think, the marginal comment is a remark at a more philosophical level, at which the whole discussion is going on at that more abstract level. Voltaire didn't refuse to engage in abstract thinking. And his point is, if it really is the case that all is now as it should be, that all is right, it's just that we don't always see that it is right, then what room is left for hope? He doesn't mean I'm going to be too depressed to go on with living if I accept this doctrine of optimism. But some of the remarks he makes in the philosophical dictionary do seem to come close to that, about the philosophers being reduced to despair. He's making a conceptual point about the preconditions for hope. If the world were perfect, and this is similar to some of the points that Leibniz makes in those more dynamic passages, if the world really were perfect, there would be no possibility for hope. There'd be no need for hope, I suppose, what I said. But
yeah, I guess I was still resisting that thought and thinking that there's room for hope if you don't know the details. And I mean, in a way, I agree that if you think this earthquake, this is just great, that would be sort of odd and lead people to despair. But the is there is really talking about the world and its entire history, both past, present, and future. And so I guess I'm not a defender of Leibnizian optimism, but I'm just thinking he might be able to just respond by saying, you got to step back and broaden the focus a little bit more, as you were suggesting.
So this is just a small point. I mean, I was picking up on the same thing. I thought the suggestion that optimism undermines hope seemed sort of maybe doubly wrong. One, it seems like it's consistent with hope, and I think that's the point other people have been making, and you could think about whether it's conceptually or not. The second smaller point is that I wonder if it's also psychologically implied in the following sense. Is it not a comfort to think that this is all some part of the plan that's for the best? And it seems to me that that's a pretty plausible psychological thesis. I mean, one thinks of the Nietzsche quote that's, people don't mind suffering, they hate pointless suffering. And so it does seem to me that there's a strong solace to the thought that, if you could believe that, it would be comforting, it seems to me. And that seems, giving that up is to give up some sort of comfort. That's a powerful strain in sort of the history of thought there. Anyway, that was the second part, was the psychological thesis.
I'll come back to that.
Okay, then.
Some of us don't even like suffering with a point.
Yeah, but it's better, right?
I suppose it's better. But getting back again to the question of hope and what's so great about hope anyway, and wondering what the point of defending hope is. If you look back, for example, to Spinoza, one of the very interesting observations of Spinoza is that, but of course he was not original in this, is that whenever there's hope, there's also fear. You hope for something good, but you fear that it isn't going to happen. And so one of the extremely interesting observations about Spinoza's view is that what we want to do is get rid of both hope and fear. And it does seem to me that from that point of view, perhaps Voltaire's critique of optimism isn't so powerful.
I think this is interesting in relation to your point. Yes, hope can be a negative emotion, and the Spinoza point makes sense of that. It's not to have hope; it's also to have fear, and that's to live in a state of constant anxiety lest you not have your hopes realised, and so on. But then Spinoza had a lot to compensate for the lack of hope. The idea of transition through understanding negative passions to a greater state of activity, freedom, intellectual joy. There's a whole strand of network of things in his philosophy that compensate for the lack of hope, I think. So I agree with you in relation to Spinoza that it's possible to make sense of a positive attitude to life. Let's put it that way.
For Spinoza, the idea is that, but again, that connects with his necessitarianism. If you know it couldn't be otherwise, then if something bad happens to you, there's no sense of regret because it couldn't have been otherwise. It's not something that you could have done, that anybody could have done. It just is. And that's obviously an attitude that Leibniz would not have.
Yes, I think Spinoza has a way of avoiding the negativity of what Leibniz calls the Stoic sense of fate.
Right.
He has a story to tell about how the understanding of necessity can be joyful.
Right. But that's not a story that Leibniz...
It's not a story that Leibniz will accept, because he won't accept that universal necessity.
I was somewhat surprised by your quote from Leibniz that everything changes for the best, sometimes even by leaps and bounds, and the use you could make of that with your metaphor of taking a step back, so better to leap. Is there some way that you can square that with Leibniz's insistence on the principle of continuity, that for something to go from one state to another, it must go through all intermediate states?
I don't know the answer to that, but I didn't want to. I mean, I was tracking a metaphor and using the content to that metaphor, but offering an alternative content to the idea of standing back, which would be a different form of detachment and one closer to Voltaire. But I don't want to, and I'm not competent to defend the content of those passages where he uses that metaphor for the future of the human race. I find them intriguing, and I find them surprising when I came across them, and my only contact with them has been through Maria Rose's biography. But the only use I wanted to make of them was that there is another possible way of thinking of Leibniz's idea of standing back in order the better to see the whole, which takes us nearer to Voltaire. But I don't want to put any more significance on it than that. And some might think that already goes too much into the realm of the play with metaphor. But I think it's quite a legitimate approach to the history of philosophy to track the metaphors and notice the way they change and see how they operate differently in different texts and the different assumptions they bring. But that's another whole story. But yes, I share your puzzlement about the content of those fragments. But I don't feel at all competent to either defend or bits on that, or even to explain what exactly he had in mind with that spiral talk of human history. That became as a complete surprise to me.
Catherine Wilson.
In trying to sort out the different kinds of hope and optimism, I think it might be useful to introduce the notion of effort, because effort can have either a negative or a positive relation to hope. So, for example, rough contemporary of Voltaire, Adam Smith, who says, we look out on the world, we see all this misery, we know that the world was created by us and is in the hands of a benevolent God, therefore we should just let things take their course because we know that God wills the happiness of all men. Whereas for Voltaire and for Leibniz, effort, hope is what motivates effort. Effort requires hope, the hope that your efforts will actually bear fruit, and same with Kant. So you can see hope as a sort of necessary condition of trying, rather than just thinking it's God's responsibility or it's futile because everything doesn't work out anyway. These 18th century pessimists.
Yes, I'm not convinced that Adam Smith really believed those more religious statements in the theory of moral
maybe
sentiments,
not, but it's
especially.
an example of a
I
thought one can have.
Some of them are ironic, I think, and I think also he, even when he talks in religious tones, mostly the actual argumentation doesn't depend on the belief in God. But still, this doesn't affect the basic point that you're making. There's a range of different ways of connecting hope.
I think he is a little passive, isn't he, about the misery of labour? That's just how it is.
Yeah. Mark.
Thank you very much for your paper. It was especially grateful for the dynamism that you brought back to Leibniz, because one thing that's puzzled me now as a returning Leibnizian is how spectatorial our discussions of Leibniz are, when Leibniz was not only hyper-energetic in life, but understood a cosmology that was always in movement. So it always seems to me that even, so I want to go with the critique bit and say everything's moving all the time. Leibniz's arguments are trying to convince us in one way to keep moving or to move in one direction. It's never to move from stasis into movement. So I'm very interested, and I'll be trying to talk about this on Thursday, by your suggestion that there's something in the perhaps aesthetic real appreciation of beauty that opens up, you put it better than I'll be able to put it, an awareness of possibilities that did not occur.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could say something about them in connection with the hope question.
Ah, that's an interesting point. Yes, I think what I would say about that is that I think with a bit of thought I could probably construct a Leibnizian version of hope that rested not on the doctrine of the best of all possible worlds, but on, as far as it does, on those aspects of the concept of perfection which relate to the grasp of alternative possibilities. And it's another way of coming at his attack on the Stoic version of necessity, I think, because I think that's one of the things on Leibniz's behalf. He didn't say it himself in the preface to the Theodicy, but I think it is one of the things that does make his version of what he calls fate there in that context different from anything that's gone before. He's trying to keep the necessity that he takes from Spinoza, but to combine it with divine will, which of course Spinoza won't accept. Now, I'd go with Spinoza rather than with Leibniz on that one, but nonetheless, I think you're right in suggesting that if one were to develop that version of Leibniz's actuality as being rich with ideas of alternative possibilities, then that already gives you a basis for hope of a kind which, without rejecting Leibnizian perfection, would meet Voltaire's criticisms, I think. Because the core of Voltaire's objection, and this comes back, I did want to come back to your point, is that there's no possibility here. There are no possibilities left if everything is right. That's why there's no hope. Not because I feel bleak when I think of that, but because conceptually it's impossible to make sense of hope without having the idea of alternative possibilities. Now, what I wanted to suggest in that bit of the paper, and a lot more would need to be said about it, was that despite Leibniz believing that there are no unrealised possibles, he nonetheless has possibility conceptually built into his very understanding of what's actual. And I think that's enough to allow for conceptual conditions for hope and to meet Voltaire's marginal comment.
Larry.
Thank you for this paper. I was particularly interested in the section where you talked about the aesthetic dimension of Leibniz, and you drew on Beiser's work, but you hesitated to go with Beiser in describing his account to Leibniz. And so
Sorry,
maybe I misunderstood what you
No,
were saying.
I did pull back because
Okay.
I think he... Well, I pulled back partly because I wasn't persuaded by it, but partly because I don't myself have enough understanding of German romantic philosophy to really judge it, but also because I didn't think I needed to rest my argument on the details of Byz's account of perfection. I thought I could just take some aspects of it. And what I did take from it was the interconnections of principles of sufficient reason with the idea of perfection and the understanding of perfection in terms of an imperfection in terms of understanding of alternative possibilities. So that was why I didn't. I've got some reservations about, and I know Stephen Nadler in Best of All Possible Worlds book has a quite alternative sort of reading of the significance of beauty in the Theodicy. He thinks it's there, but it's low key. It's not important. It's not central. Whereas Byzer makes it the absolute core of, and that's part of the story, I think, of the Diotimous Children project. That you get this enormous emphasis on beauty, despite the fact that Leibniz didn't have an aesthetic theory. So I don't think I need all of that. That was why I pulled back, in order not to have to depend too much on Byers, and not so much because I thought he was wrong, because I don't really feel competent to judge the way he reads Wolf and
sure. That's
Lessing.
Fair enough. And,
Yeah.
and you ended, I think, that section of your paper with another place where you pulled back a little bit, or at least I perceived that you did.
Pulled back in order better to leap forward.
Yeah, you said that, right, so that you could leap forward. So you said you didn't want to ascribe to Leibniz the view that he thought we could make progress through human action, but this would give you what you needed to make this sort of conceptual space where he
Yes.
and Voltaire could occupy
Yes,
together.
I did.
And so I wondered, again, why the hesitation there, and how, if there is hesitation there, does that affect the way in which you're able to find the space in which they can both occupy?
I pulled back on that because I thought, although especially I depend on the reading of Rose's biography. We know that he was, this came up in discussion of the last paper, of course, too. We know that he was personally dedicated to trying to make a better world and to reconcile differences and to improve through technology the conditions of human life, etc. What I'm not sure about, though, is whether that idea of progress, perfectibility, is conceptually present in his works. And that's a different point, I think. And I can't see that it's there. So it was because of the lack of I was doing a conceptual narration that got me from Leibniz to Voltaire. And I'm happy to defend that, but I don't think it convinced me to saying this is what Leibniz thought he was about.
Last question, Paul Raton.
Thank you very much. A short remark. I wanted to go back to the question of hope and its meanings in a Leibnizian context. I wonder if the conception of Leibniz is making clearer if we go back to the paragraph 44 in the primary dissertation, where there is an interesting distinction between seeing and believing. And it's interesting because Leibniz says, well, if we were able to understand all harmony, we will see that what we want to criticize in particular is linked to the best possible plan. So, and he say, seeing mean knowing with a priori reason. Believing is knowing on basis of effect, of experience. So we can believe when we have the experience of evils in particular, we can believe that God permits them for good reason, but we don't know in detail these reasons. I think when you want to pass from belief to seeing, there is here a place for hope, because I think hope is this waiting for more reasons. It's the way you pass from belief to real knowledge, which is in the distinction Leibniz uses, see really the reason in detail for what God permits evidence.
That gives more content to the point that I mentioned about the reference to Baal. He says, you know, it's not. But he doesn't mean that he doesn't think that it's his responsibility to, or even if it could be done, to show in any particular case how this fits into the best of all possible worlds. And he puts it even a bit more negatively than the section you're quoting. I think he says it's enough for my purposes if I can show that it's possible, that there's nothing to stop it fitting into the best of all possible worlds. But I don't, you know, it's explicit about not needing to do what Pangloss thinks he can do. But that, I think that's a neater, the bit you're quoting from us, that makes the point more neatly. I think it's useful.
Okay. Thank you very much.